welcome to the Messiantics Podcast, a podcast about all things Messianic Judaism. Each episode, we will be sharing our opinions as we tackle some of the biggest issues in Messianic Judaism. Now here's your hosts, Rabbis Eric, David, Jonathan, and Toby.
Welcome back to our podcast. Last week we didn't have an episode online because a couple of our podcast team members were attending the UMJC conference, the annual conference, family conference, and during that time, Rabbi David was elected to be the vice president of the UMJC, or the Union of Messianic Jewish Congregations. And Toby, you were also appointed to a position.
My wife and I, yes,
right,
as co-chairs of the youth program.
Which the conferences tend to be a place where people not only gather together to hear teachings, to hear music and worship artists like Joshua Aaron and others, but it's also a place where Messianic believers go to meet other Messianic believers, to make connection, because the truth is those that are not yet married want to marry somebody like-minded, with a like vision, desires, all the things. They want the lifestyle to be similar and walking in the same direction. So attending a conference where people from all over the country and the world would be at is a great pond to go fishing in, so to speak. So that brought up the discussion that we're going to have today, which is about not matchmaking, although we probably could do an episode of that at some point, but about Messianics marrying other Messianics, and specifically, should Messianic Jewish believers, people who are genetically Jewish, genealogically Jewish, should they marry non-Jewish people who are Messianic or not? Should, in the greater Jewish world, it's really pushed for Jewish people to marry Jewish people so that there would be a continuum of Lador Vador, generation to generation, a continuum of the Jewish people. I know that my grandparents and my parents, I was going to Japan one time for a scholarship, spend a year in Japan, and my grandmother, the only thing she said was, please don't marry a Japanese girl while you're there. She was very, very concerned that I would marry a Jewish woman. To continue Israel, to continue the people, to continue that. But the question is, does that and is that relevant to those of us who are Messianic Jews and Messianic non-Jews or Gentiles? Is there still a separation or a desire for only Jews to marry Jews within the Messianic Jewish movement or Messianic Judaism? And so that's the discussion we're going to have today. And the funny story about my experience is that when I got married, I married a non-Jewish woman. My wife, Pammy, was raised non-Jewish in a non-Jewish family in a Christian home, separated completely from Judaism, not involved in anything Jewish at all. And it wasn't until later years that we found out, because she was adopted by her parents, that her actual genetic family was Jewish. So I married a Gentile who turned out to be a Jew. And that didn't really change anything in our relationship. So we're going to have this discussion, and we're just going to hash it out and talk about it from different perspectives. And we hope that at the end of this episode, you'll be informed, and we'll have made it also enjoyable to listen to.
I think that for me, and this is Rabbi Toby. I'm not ethnically Jewish. My wife is not ethnically Jewish either. And my wife was actually raised in the Messianic movement. I was raised in the church, and God called me into Messianic Judaism back in 2005. So listen to the first episode if you want to hear my backstory. But for me, I think that everybody should have questions to consider and questions that need answered when you're looking for a partner, when you're looking for your spouse.
Right.
All those questions need to go to God. Allow God to hash those out. It was when I was praying, if my wife, my current wife, and my only. If when I was considering Brooke as a wife, I took it to God constantly. And there was no question in my mind as far as, is she Jewish or not? My first main concerns was, there are some deal breakers. I wanted to marry someone Messianic.
Right.
I didn't want to have to deal with Messianic Judaism. What God had called me to was too important for me to allow that to be a dispute.
Right.
And it has been disputes with couples, Right. So, was she Messianic? Check. Does she love God with all her heart? Check. Does she love her neighbor as herself? Check. And then there's the other personal things like,
right.
Do you share common interests and all those things, and of course I thought she was beautiful and attractive and all those things. But I'm not a PhD. I didn't do all the research in the world and read all the documents, but I did a little research. I know what Chabad says about intermarriage, which is no.
Right.
But in Messianic Judaism, in light of the gospel, in light of the new covenant, I feel like the conversation of intermarriage between a Messianic Jew and a Messianic Gentile, I feel like those things, that conversation should look and sound radically different, because I think it's unhealthy in the Messianic movement if you have Messianic Jews telling their kids, or Messianic Jews themselves saying, I'm looking for, like, them being born Jewish is a deal breaker. I think that's unhealthy, and I think there's scriptural evidence of that. When I look at Rahab, when I look at Ruth, when I look at Caleb, God didn't say, hey, Rahab, you can come into Israel, but hey boys, she's off limits because she's not Jewish, right?
Right.
And it's same with Ruth.
Yeah, it's actually traditionally taught that Rahab married Joshua.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And then through them come many of the priestly lineage of those of the priestly lineage.
Right.
It's interesting to me as we jump into this conversation. I want to hear from Rabbi Jonathan, Rabbi David also, but we somehow forget that when all of this covenant stuff began, it started with Abraham and Sarah, who were non-Jews. They became Hebrews when they crossed over and started following the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But when they had a child, and their child Isaac needed a bride, there were no Jewish brides. There were no Hebrew brides. So Abraham sent his servant back to his hometown in Gentile land and brought back a Gentile woman to marry Isaac. And we do not see any kind of a ceremony or event or any particular liturgy being pronounced or anything when she comes back that converts her to Judaism,
right,
before she gets off the camel and goes to Isaac's mom's tent and they consummate their marriage.
Right.
And then we see that continuing through. Israel has always been made up of Jewish people and non-Jewish people who became part of Israel. It doesn't make them genetically Jewish, but they become part of Israel. Right. And throughout we see Gentiles marrying Jews and their children continuing to be part of the nation Israel.
Right.
And so as we get into this discussion, to find out anything biblically, if you want to get a biblical concept, you got to go back to the first usage, first mention, mm-hmm. and the first marriage of Jewish people or Hebrews, the children,
right.
The first ones that got married once they were Hebrews was one Jew marrying a non-Jew with no evidence of any kind of conversion to Judaism, right, before they get married,
or no evidence that God found it unacceptable.
Right.
And the reality is, it's not just Isaac either, because if we look at it, Abraham, as Rabbi Eric was kind of alluding to, Abraham is considered to be the first Hebrew, or for the sake of common language, we would say the first Jewish person, right? Abraham was the first Jew. So if Abraham was the first Jew and he married Sarah, well, Sarah couldn't have been Jewish, right? So through a Jew and a non-Jew, we get Isaac. Then Isaac marries, as a second Jew, marries a non-Jew. So through a Jew and a Gentile, we get Jacob. Well, Jacob marries 4 non-Jews. Through a Jew and 4 non-Jews, we get the 12 sons of Israel, who all marry non-Jews.
Right.
From whom we get the 12 tribes of Israel.
Well, now we don't know that all the children married non-Jews. We just know the wives' names and things, but we really don't know how many of them were Israelites that were born in Egypt and lived in Israel, and how many were Egyptians.
No, I'm talking the 12 sons all married non-Jews, and then their children. Down the line, it's more than likely
right. Their
that
children
they married non-Jews. Yeah, but nonetheless, the reality is we wouldn't have Israel today. We would not have the Jewish people today if it wasn't for God using Jew and Gentile alike to
in marriage,
in marriage to literally birth the nation of Israel.
Right.
And so when we look at the Torah, one of the big, and it's the same. Realistically, the same scriptures that we get the idea of that your mother has to be Jewish, right? The tradition in rabbinic Judaism is that in order for you to be Jewish, your mother has to be Jewish, or more accurately put, your mother's mother has to be Jewish. And so in order for you, by rabbinic tradition, in order for you to be Jewish, your mother's mother has to be Jewish. And that comes from, there's several times in the Torah, and particularly I think it's Deuteronomy 7, if I remember correctly, but there's several places in the Torah that the Torah specifically says, do not let your sons and daughters marry outside the tribes of Israel, lest they be led astray to serve the gods of the lands around them.
Right.
The qualifier isn't whether or not the person they're marrying is Jewish or not.
Exactly.
The qualifier is that they not be led astray, right? And so when we look at that command, what ends up happening is that's the baseline for today, why your mother has to be Jewish for you to be considered Jewish. The problem is it says don't let your sons or your daughters. It doesn't say just don't let your daughters. The other side of that is very specifically the qualifier is that they not be led astray. Right. So when we're talking within the construct of Messianic Judaism, if somebody like Toby and Brooke, who are very adamantly devoted to Messianic Judaism, this is who they are. This is rooted in and ingrained in their identity and their walk with the Lord, and everything that they do is filtered through it, and so on. That's somebody that's not going to lead somebody astray. Right. Now, kind of like with my dad didn't intend to necessarily marry a Jewish woman. Not that he was against the idea either, but it wasn't like, it wasn't a priority. He wasn't solely looking at it. Matter of fact, if you listen to his story of how he met my mom, and the plethora of girls before that he was interested in, it had nothing to do with whether they were Jewish or not. It really sounds more like if they were breathing or not was the qualifier. It was like
he's right here.
He looked up at the choir in the church that he came to faith in, and was like, "Oh, there's a girl. I like her. I'm going to come back to meet her." And then
she had to be pretty and breathing.
And then she was announced as being engaged. So
she sings good.
Yeah. So then she was announced as being engaged. So the next time he comes in, he's like, "Oh, there's another girl. I like her. I'm going to go meet her." And it kept happening. Right. But nonetheless, when
she made him fried chicken, and that was
it wasn't the primary objective was to marry a Jewish girl, right? And oddly enough, I wasn't going out of my way to marry somebody who was Jewish. I wasn't against the idea either, but I was my big thing was, like Toby was saying, need to be somebody in Messianic Judaism.
Right. And my primary thing actually was, is she a believer? Is she pretty?
Good save.
And is she alive? So, those... Yeah. So, but it really was, and we're talking about the same thing. I wanted her to be in a covenant relationship with the Messiah. And that was my first thing. That's why it was in the church and the choir, not in the bar.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah. And like I said, I wasn't going out of my way to marry somebody that was Jewish either. It just happened that my wife is Jewish, and funny enough, she was my one and only girlfriend. So it's not even like I shopped around a lot. She was my one and only girlfriend, and I married her, and she happened to be Jewish as well, which was a win as far as that goes. Not because it's an obligation, but because it makes things a lot easier in general.
Y'all got married pretty young, didn't you?
We did. I was 19, she was 18, and so and by the grace of God. It was 8 years later before we had our first kid, so I didn't have to have all the shotgun wedding conversations or anything like that.
Right.
The accusations were there, but we didn't have to have the conversations.
When I hear the stories, and I have known Messianic Jewish people. And again, if I hear ultra-Orthodox laying that out, only marry born Jews, I understand it more. I guess I understand it to a degree, even if I took the Tanakh by itself even if I took the Old Testament by itself without the New Testament,
right,
it still wouldn't make sense. We haven't even gotten into the New Covenant.
Right.
What I'm saying is we're only talking about scriptures in the Old Testament. So even with that, it doesn't make sense. But I understand that more coming from ultra-Orthodox than Messianic Jews. And I have heard of Messianic Jews informing, either they themselves or informing their kids, only marry a born Jew, and as if there's some advantage to that. And you can explain all the whatever advantages you think that is.
Right.
I think that that's limiting God, but I also think that that's it inadvertently, or maybe advertently, it depends on the person, I suppose. You're labeling non-Jewish people in the movement as second class, that somehow it's a disadvantage to marry a non-Jew, when they have the same spirit, and that God views them as the same value.
Right. And they're not violating the what Rabbi David was talking about.
Yeah, they're not violating anything.
They're going to lead you astray from. Matter of fact, you meet enough Gentiles in the Messianic movement. Some of them are a little more committed than some of the people who were born into, or just became believers who are already Jewish.
If the Commonwealth of Israel is an olive tree, which is made up of natural branches and grafted in branches.
Right.
If those grafted in branches and natural branches are going to reproduce, they're not going to reproduce by joining other trees than Israel. They're only going to be able to reproduce the fruit of Israel by remaining part of that tree, that variety. It doesn't make sense to me that whether historically, biblically, culturally, whatever, that the primary requirement for a spouse should be unity in the belief and the covenant of Yeshua.
Right.
And the fullness of the covenants of God, which complete in Yeshua.
Yeah. For me, being Messianic was a deal breaker.
Right.
But it's not like it has to be Messianic. I think it would be helpful if they were open to it.
It's going to be easier.
Now, see, to me, I would say...
For me, it was a deal breaker.
Right, it would be a deal breaker because when it comes to having children...
Right.
If one of the spouses is Messianic and believes in keeping the feasts and festivals and Shabbat and eating kosher and all the things that are part of a community life, and the other spouse does not, when you have children, it feeds problems and division and stuff that don't need to be there. So
it's unstable.
Yeah. So to me,
it can be, not always. But it can
so
be.
To me, that would be a deal breaker. But Jewish versus non-Jewish would not be a deal breaker because I know a lot of Jewish people that aren't believers in Yeshua. That according to those who think Jewish believers should only marry Jewish people, they would prefer them to marry a non-believing Jewish person over a believing Gentile.
And that's harmful.
And that's diluting the faith.
Yeah.
And ultimately doing what is the fear, which is to dilute Judaism to the point of not being there anymore. My grandfather would often say that my wife, who at the time we thought was still Gentile, was a better Jew than he and some of the other members in our family because of her level and choice to be observant, not out of legalism, but her lifestyle was much more traditional and Judaic and than many of the Jewish people in my family were.
Right. Yeah, and it's, I think, an even better story from the patriarchs is the story of Rahab and Boaz, and I think that's part of the reason why
Ruth and Boaz.
Sorry, I think that's why that's there, is to because that's not really a question that Boaz comes at Ruth with, or to the elders of the community with, or that we see that's written anyway, is that, they clearly don't have a problem with her being who she is, which, by the way, her people group were one of the enemies of God's people.
Yeah. And her conversion was simply, your people shall be my people, your God.
Right, and there really was no conversion. She was, again, like we've been talking about with the wives of the patriarch.
She to faith in the God of Israel.
Yeah, she just kind of shows up and begins living after the God of Israel with Naomi, doing the things of her community. And that's what, it's like, that matters clearly more to the elders of that city and to Boaz, maybe they were wrong. Don't know.
Yeah, but she becomes in covenant relationship with the God of Israel, but she is still called Ruth the Moabitess throughout the rest of the book. She is never called Ruth the Jewess or Ruth the convert to Judaism, or Ruth she's called Ruth the Moabitess even after.
Yeah.
And that's why I'm so repeating this idea of being in covenant relationship with Yeshua and the God of Israel rather than being Jewish.
And the thing about it too, specifically with Ruth, is Ruth was a Moabite, who the Moabites were one of the people groups that God said would not be allowed to become a part of Israel for up at least 10 generations. And he doesn't say that they can't, that Israel is supposed to keep all the Gentiles away, right? He specifically says there were a few groups, the Moabites being one, the Midianites being one, said that for 10 generations they cannot become a part of Israel. They cannot become in covenant relationship with Israel. And I think that's an important thing to grasp, because this goes back to some of our earlier conversations with Jews and Gentiles and whether or not Gentiles should be able to participate in Torah observance and the lifestyle practice and so a life cycle practice of Judaism, so on. Is the Lord specifically says that these few people groups were not allowed to become a part of Israel. He doesn't say anything about converting, but it's that idea of covenant relationship with Israel. They cannot come into covenant relationship with Israel for a certain number of generations. And then we have Ruth, who's a Moabite, who is of that people group that was not allowed to be a part of the nation of Israel, that is now coming into covenant relationship with Israel. There's a redemption factor that goes into that's important. But even more so is if we trace that back, the reason it was a problem to begin with between the Moabites and Israel was because the Moabites are descendants of Lot, who Abraham brought with him and wasn't supposed to begin with. And had Abraham listened to God to begin with, the Moabites wouldn't have been there at all. And so the whole reality is that the Moabites, who were descendants of Lot, who ultimately are related to Abraham, were not a part of the covenant. One, because Abraham brought Lot when he wasn't supposed to, and two, because instead of working it out so that Lot could be a part of the covenant, he pushed Lot away, and then ends up doing the same thing with his other children born of Keturah after Sarah dies. He ends up doing the same thing, and in Genesis 25 it says that he pushed all of them out to the east, and those become the people groups that become problems for Israel later on down the road. But the reality is that the discussion of whether or not those are the nations can become in covenant relationship with Israel was never a discussion that was turned down. It was never something that God said it can't happen. What God said was that these certain people groups for a certain length of time cannot. But then all of a sudden, Ruth, who's a Moabite, becomes a part of Israel, covenant relationship with Israel, and is in the lineage of Melech David and of Yeshua. Which is a very important reality when we look at the whole structure and concept.
Yeah, it's frustrating when I see, and there's nothing new under the sun, and God doesn't change, and the issues we see in Scripture, which are thousands and thousands of years old, are the same as that we encounter today. Mm-hmm. But it is frustrating when I see ancient Israel more accommodating than present day. We haven't even talked about anything in the new covenant yet.
Right, we're just in Tanakh.
We're only talking about how open it was to participate in the Tanakh, and I look at all the layers and the fences that have been created.
Yeah, it's interesting to me
later.
To go along with this. It's exactly what you're saying is we don't find anywhere in Paul's writings a prohibition of Gentiles marrying Jewish people among believers. I mean, Paul talks about all kinds of community issues and relationships that were out of God's will, incest and adultery and fornication, all these things. But not once does Paul, who is the Jewish ambassador to the nations, who started communities in the nations with Jewish and non-Jewish people, and not once do we see Paul saying, okay, now here's the deal. You Jewish people need to only marry Jewish people, and you Gentile people need to only marry Gentile people in your community, because this is really important that we establish this and validate this.
In fact, in Galatians, we see that he ends up having beef with Peter, because Peter stopped having relationship with Gentile believers. Even though Peter was the first one God used to open up the door for restoration and inclusion for Gentiles, Peter stopped having relationship with the Gentile believers, particularly because of a very similar conversation of what we're having right now, which was that there were Jewish believers who were very closely connected to Jewish non-believers who were very upset that there were Gentiles involved because they thought it was going to water down Judaism. And they didn't want to upset the Jewish people, kind of like what's the big pastor in Texas that's buddy with the
not Olstein, is it?
No,
Hagee.
John Hagee, who's big buddy with a bunch of Orthodox guys and wants nothing to do with Messianic Judaism in his Kufi, Christians United for Israel, because he's afraid that we're going to damage his relationship with the Orthodox. Not because he's so keen on sharing Yeshua with them, but because he doesn't want to harm his relationships with them. And it's a similar thing. Like Peter was afraid of harming his relationships with the traditional Jewish world and with the more Orthodox leaning Jewish believers, Orthodox of their day, leaning Jewish believers, than he was with being inclusive of the very people that God first used him to bring restoration and inclusivity to.
Right. I think my question would be to pose is that, and we're kind of going along with conversations we've had before on the podcast, is that, who you marry, pretty big decision.
Absolutely.
Pretty significant life decision. Like, I would think that, and so I don't understand, I guess, why, we want to ignore, and I'm not saying all, but there's a lot of other stuff in the Torah that's important too. Very important to your walk with God. And, people have no problem ignoring some of those commandments and some of those traditions.
Sure.
But this one, and I get, again, marriage is important. I'm not saying it's not. But if it's more important that you marry a believer, for Messianics, if you marry someone who believes in Yeshua,
sure,
then and look, we're already a limited pool,
right?
Yeah. I mean, we are the kiddie pool.
That's why Rabbi Eric talked about the conferences being these
right. Like, and we're not even the nice.
I did not say meat markets.
That's what
I said. Fishing pond. I'm sorry.
I like Toby's description better.
That's what Brooke called it. My wife. I got that from my wife. Thank you. I love you, honey. She said.
But
when you're, I'm sorry. I don't mean that to be inappropriate. I mean that as Brooke said. Oh yeah, they can be like meat markets. You see those people, and you see them interacting, and that they're there because their local congregational pool.
I will take a cut of prime rib for 200.
So. And I mean, I met my wife at a conference, and but
so it works.
Yeah,
but the reality that I think Rabbi Jonathan just brought up is, I know people who are Jewish, who are Messianic, who are Jewish, who have absolutely no problem eating a pork sandwich or a shrimp or crab or lobster, but would not marry a non-Jewish person, or they have no problem not keeping Shabbat.
Right.
Going to Shabbat, to a restaurant, or going to a movie theater or whatever on Shabbat, but they would not marry a non-Jewish person.
There's something wrong with that.
And I think that God established marriage as a covenant relationship that emulates his relationship with us.
Absolutely.
Right.
And he didn't look down at the Gentiles and say, I can't marry you because you're not one of the descendants of Abraham.
Because you're goy. Yeah.
I just can't imagine, like, and again, back to because we're not even like the kiddie pool that's nice and concrete and in the ground. We're like the blow up rubber yellow ducky thing that sprays water out the front. Just like using the garden hose. You've got a limited. I mean, I think people limit themselves to what's available because if you're at like these conferences and there's several. My parents raised my siblings and I. Like they completely preached against the whole "there's one person for you." They were like, "There's probably about 50 people in the world that you would do very well with, being married to." And they were like, "So you have to pick one of those, but then that's your one."
Absolutely.
And then so if you go to these conferences and there's several wonderful believing Gentiles
in the meat market,
it's
in the meat market,
it's a big
several prime ribs in the.
Yeah. What are you gonna do?
How and you go, okay, well they're not Jewish, so I can't. Skip. And let's say God brings these people along to potentially be a blessing. You ignore that. And again, I'm huge about when a blessing comes along, you should take it. Because if you don't, you end up robbing the person who gives the blessing and you become a thief. And so you either rob God or you rob, others. So to me, it's just kind of like I would want to marry someone who lives like me because, regardless of genetics, because their genetics is not going to determine our marital outcome. Their genetics is not going to determine how our children are raised, the education of our children, the discipline of our children.
And it doesn't necessarily keep them out of the land of Israel. If it's an aliyah thing, sometimes I think it's about that.
Yeah, sure.
So I'm gonna,
and it doesn't. Yeah, legally, it doesn't keep them out.
I'm gonna loosely play devil's advocate here, just to set some context to the conversation, but also because at the end of me setting the context, I want to make a statement that kind of reestablishes our approach here in this conversation. And to play devil's advocate, I really do. I get where a lot of these people are coming from because the mindset is if. We have multiple generations of Jewish believers who marry non-Jews. Before long, there's not enough Jewish blood left in that lineage to actually be considered Jewish. So there's this perception that marrying a whole bunch of non-Jews in the lineage down, then ultimately you get 3 or 4 generations later and they're no longer Jewish. And there's this watering down of the Jewish people, watering down of Messianic Judaism, what have you. And I can get it. I can see where that's coming from. I can see it if me as a Jewish person, if I marry somebody that's non-Jewish, and then we have children, and our children marry somebody that's non-Jewish, and then they have children, and they marry somebody that's non-Jewish, now they're 1/8 of their lineage is Jewish, which is, 1, not enough for Aliyah, 2, not enough for any of the Messianic organizations to consider them to be Jewish, and so on. And so I get that perspective. I understand that. And again, I'm just stating this for devil's advocate. But I see a couple of problems with it. Number one is, one of the fears is that Messianic Judaism will no longer be Jewish, that it will be predominantly Gentile. And so there's 2 issues with that. Number one, it already is. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, because those Gentiles who are part of Messianic Judaism very much yearn to have that covenant relationship we're talking of with Messianic Judaism and with the Jewish people.
And to keep it Jewish.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Number 2 is most of, not all, but a significant number of the rabbis and the leaders in the Messianic Jewish movement that I've grown up under for the last 40 years of my life are almost all married to non-Jews. Not all of them, but there's a significant portion that are married to non-Jews. Mm-hmm. And so they're saying, hey, you can't do it. It was okay for me, but you can't do it. You've got to. Now, on the other side is, if we truly believe that the modern Messianic Jewish movement is an end-time revival movement, that it's something that God is doing to bring restoration and revival to the Jewish headship of the body of Messiah, then we have to also believe that if this is a divinely orchestrated reality, that God isn't going to let something like some Messianic Jewish people marrying Gentiles be the thing that puts the nail in the coffin and runs it all on the ground.
Right.
Yeah,
the reality is, and you mentioned a word, Rabbi David, that we've talked about before in other subjects, and that's the word fear. we as the body of believers can't operate out of fear. We have to operate out of faith. And I personally don't believe that if God said there would be Jewish believers when Yeshua returns, that there would be a Messianic Judaism when Yeshua returns, I don't believe that there's anything we can do that will undo God's prophetic word, that will change God's. It's kind of like people who say we need to not eat this or do that or not have all these children or not use this kind of electrical stuff or not use this kind of gas because we're going to destroy the world. The truth is we can't destroy this world, this planet, a day before God said it would be destroyed and all things are fulfilled. Right. So operating out of fear in any realm is not operating out of faith. And so I used my example. I wasn't concerned with marrying a Jewish woman. I was concerned with marrying a woman of faith, someone who is in covenant with God, someone who loved the Lord. And so I married my wife, and it turns out she's Jewish. Right. Now, that wasn't a purposeful thing, but it is a continuation of God's plan outside of my engineering. I didn't plan it. I didn't work it out. I didn't sit there and make a list of all the Jewish believers in the country and say, okay, this is my working list. This is all I have. I trusted that God would bring the woman that was right for me into my life, that had the same values, the same heart, the same desires, the same covenant relationship that I had. And I went with that woman and I married her. And then it turns out she's Jewish. And God did sovereignly what he wanted to do without my engineering, without my choosing to marry Jewish. And I think that if God's word says there will be Jewish believers at the end, that there's nothing we can do that's going to stop God's word from being fulfilled. And that if we just faithfully look for spouses within the body of believers, within the Messianic movement, that God is well able to keep a remnant of Jewish believers to fulfill his word without our engineering and planning.
Rabbi Eric, you remind me of a story, especially when and Rabbi Jonathan too, when we talked about, and David, I think we've all mentioned it about Aliyah, making Aliyah. I remember I was at the Messiah conference over 10 years ago, and I was in a class, and I'm not going to mention any names, but I was in one of the sessions. I was in one of the sessions at the Messiah conference, and it's been a while. It's been over 10 years. And the people that were presenting the class were from Israel. And they live there. And they're Jewish. And I was enjoying the class until we got to the question section. And a guy raised his hand that was in the audience. And they were like, yes, and acknowledged him. And he said, I'm not Jewish. I'm Messianic. I love Israel. I love God. I love the Jewish people. I'm praying because I want to live there. And I know I'm not Jewish. And I know that, at this point I won't be considered, given citizenship. And I can't make Aliyah as a non-Jew, but I want to live there. And, do you guys, since you live there, know how that would be possible for me? And her response, this person who was leading the class's response was, marry a Jewish woman. And that was it. Yeah. And she goes, but be prepared because Jewish women are this, 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 and Israeli women are this, this, this. And she went on that, but she basically said, marry a Jewish woman. And my heart sunk. And I left the class feeling just really upset on that guy's behalf and upset in general. And because would marrying a Jewish woman be a way that guy could get to Israel? Absolutely. Does that mean that's the only way God can get that dude in the land? No. And it just goes back to what Rabbi Eric said about fear. But my thing is, here we are at the national conference. Right. And your answer is that? How about just, if you want to go and you believe you're meant to be there, no matter what race you are, God will get you there. You keep praying, not marry a Jewish woman, because that might be a disaster. Right. You know what I'm saying? So it just all goes back to that thing about fear. If this is the only way this will work. God can only preserve the Jewish people if we marry other Jewish people. my family will only be able to make Aliyah if you marry Jewish kids, you know? So it all comes back to, I think what happens is fear, but there's unintended consequences to that fear, and that's, it labels others as second class. It creates a perception that other people that aren't Jewish are second class, and it also just boxes God in, like, look, God's left the building, and it's up to us to figure out how we're going to make His will happen.
Right. It amazes me. The entire book of Galatians is written about men trying to help God fulfill His prophecy. In other words, the reason that it talks about Hagar and Sarah and Ishmael and Isaac is because God had given Abraham a promise that he was going to have children, as many as the sand of the sea and the stars in the heavens. When Abraham didn't see it happening quick enough for him, he decided he was going to help God fulfill His prophecy.
Well, first he brought his nephew with him for the very same reason.
Right. And then there was Eliezer. So he's constantly trying to help God fulfill His prophetic word. And I think that part of this conversation is God is well able to fulfill His prophetic word without our assistance. And that if we just trust the leading of His Spirit, that He will lead us to a spouse that will be right for us. Mm-hmm. If we will trust Him and we will pray. And I think that's one of the things Rabbi Toby said earlier is he prayed, Lord, bring me to the right person.
Of all the ones I could marry, I want your choice.
Right. And so if we actually trust God's Ruach to lead us to the right person, then His Spirit led us there. His Spirit cannot lead us to the wrong thing that's going to bring about the wrong result.
Right.
And if we trust, then whoever, if God brings you to a Gentile woman, and that's who His Spirit led you to, then you are in His will to do what His Spirit led you to do. And if He leads you to a Jewish woman, His Spirit led you there, then you are in His will to marry that person. And following His will cannot result in ungodliness, unrighteousness, or violating or changing or nullifying the prophecies that He gave us.
Absolutely. That was a good ending.
Yeah. And with that thought, we're going to close out this particular podcast. If you have comments or thoughts you want to share with us, feel free to add them in any of the comment locations where you hear and listen to our podcast, or email us or Facebook message us through our Facebook, and we'll respond to those things. I want to remind you also, we're always looking for ideas for future content. So if you have a conversation you want us to have, please also message us, send that, comment that, and we will, in a future podcast, talk about your conversation. Thank you, and shalom.
Thank you for listening to the Messianics podcast. Make sure to subscribe so you can be notified every time we drop a new episode. And be sure to follow and interact with us on social media at Messianics Podcast.